When you have a mixture, it's often desirable to separate the different components of the mixture, and we will talk about 4 different separation techniques in this class. The first technique that we will talk about is filtration. Now, this is a technique that you probably have used in your life, whether you have called it that or not. It is a very widely used separation technique, and we use filtration primarily when you have a mixture with 2 different phases. So if you have a solid and a liquid, you can use filtration to separate them. Another separation technique that we will talk about is distillation. Distillation is commonly used when you have 2 different substances, both in the liquid phase. Talk about more about what that means in just a second. The third separation technique that we use commonly is called decanting. I bet that you also have used this technique before, although you probably haven't used this word. Decanting is most effective in separating a solid from a liquid, and it works best with a heterogeneous mixture where the solid is more dense than the liquid, and so it has sunk to the bottom. The last technique that we'll talk about is chromatography, and chromatography is a very, very, very broad type of separation technique. We use it with all different kinds of things, and there's a lot of different applications of chromatography. Maybe you've heard of TLC, maybe you've heard of HPLC, a lot of separation techniques that end with LC stand for liquid chromatography. So this is something that is used all of the time in analysis. For example, if someone were to take a pregnancy test, like a little line shows up, that technique is using chromatography. Chromatography tends to be used more often for scientific analysis, and it has to do often with the structure of the molecules, and we're not quite ready to talk about how that works, but by the end of this course, we will definitely be ready. So let's dive into each one of these a little bit more. So filtration. One way that you are familiar with filtration, if you make coffee, you put the grounds on the top and then you put water, and then the water is run through the grounds, but if your coffee machine works well, then you don't have any grounds in your cup of coffee that you're going to drink because they've been filtered out. So filtration works by using a semi-porous membrane that allows some things to pass through and not other things. Another example of filtration, it would be like an air filter. It allows the gas to move through the filter, the air that you breathe, but it doesn't allow like dust and other solid particles in the air to pass through. Let's talk about distillation. Distillation, when we're separating 2 liquids, the types of liquids that you can separate are liquids that have a significantly different boiling point. So what you do is you boil the mixture of the 2 or more liquids together, and the one that boils first will turn into a gas and it will start to move upwards in your container. And then at the top of that container, you have a chamber that cools the gas back down, but instead of cooling it back into the original flask, it goes sideways into another flask. And this is how whiskey is distilled, this is how water is distilled. You can use it to separate a liquid from a dissolved solid as well, which is what they're doing in distilled water. So if you've ever boiled a pot of water on the stove and forgot about it, and then you came back and there's like a white residue on the edges of your pot, you've basically boiled off the water and left what was dissolved in the water in your pot. If you had collected that water from boiling it into another vessel, that would have been an example of distillation, and you would have water that would be free of those things that were dissolved in it. The next, decanting. This is just basically a fancy word for pouring. So if you've ever made like pasta and you were too lazy to go get a colander, or maybe the colander was dirty or whatever, and you like just take your pot and you dump it over the sink, and you dump in such a way that you hope all of the water goes down the sink and all of the pasta stays in the pot, that is called decanting. And this works really well if you have a solid that sits at the bottom of your solution rather than floating at the top, so that you can easily pour the liquid off without pouring the solid as well. Decanting and filtration are often both good options for the same type of thing. So decanting would be a quicker method. Filtration would be more precise. So just depending on what you're doing, you may choose one or the other. And then lastly, chromatography. As we talked about, we're not quite ready to talk about the science behind it, but it's such a widely used method for separating things that I wanted to mention it here.